My name is Devin. You may have, if you signed up for the history bowl outside, you may have got my email. Thank you for that. It's gonna be great. Okay, now I got that out of the way. This is my presentation on the history of Iceland, which I have some unexplainable, obsession for. Okay, so before it was actually settled, Iceland was of course created by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge right here. So it's like one of two lands that are actually in the middle of two divergent plates. That's geologic history. So it began to form about 20 million years ago from a bunch of volcanic eruptions. All the volcanoes here are red. And it's suggested that in the 4th century BCE, there was this Greek merchant named Pythias who documented all of his travels. And he may have actually visited Iceland and called this region Thule, but we can't really know for sure. But some people just take it for fact. Some people just take it as speculation. But before the actual settlement, there were these Irish monks called potbars that may have just migrated to Iceland periodically, lived there, and then came back to Ireland. And we know this, or we possibly know this because they left artifacts behind like books and bells, and that's what the original Norsemen found when they got there. So now for the actual settlement, I'm gonna stand right here. According to old sources, Iceland was discovered by this explorer named Nadab. Yeah, a lot of the Norwegian names are very hard to pronounce and Viking-y. And he was an early settler of the Faroe Islands, which are off the northwest coast of Scotland, so they're kind of on the way to Iceland. And then the Swedish explorer Gardar Sverdsson was the first to establish that Iceland was an island. So he was actually traveling, I think, to the Faroe Islands when a storm blew off his course, and then he eventually wound up in Iceland. And apparently he sailed around the island thinking it was some new land, and then he came back and then wrote about his travels. And then he was the first to circumnavigate Iceland, so that's a big feat. And then in 874, the big leap comes when this guy named Ingolfur Nansen, that's him in a picture. He was a Norwegian chieftain. He became the first, what Icelanders considered the first permanent settler of Iceland. And 874 is a big year, because it's actually really surprising that Iceland is a lot older than many people think. So many Icelanders today, thanks to these genealogy programs run by Iceland and DNA testing, many Icelanders today can trace their heritage back to this guy, Ingolfur Nansen. And then he landed at this place called Reykjavik, or Smoky Bay. So yeah, the city of Reykjavik was actually founded by him, kind of. So Iceland is this very icy place in the North Atlantic, and it's really hard to grow crops there, so why settle there at all? There are a lot of reasons that historians think. There was a lot of available land attractive to Viking Scandinavians, and land means power. There were a lot of valuable resources, especially the sea creatures like the walrus and the fish and whales. Anyone wanting to profit and trade, like all these North seafarers wanted to do, migrated there. And for people that are being attacked by Vikings, as modern day people think of Vikings, Iceland provided a very safe asylum for anyone wanting to to get away from them. And then at the same time, in the Kingdom of Norway, the first actual king, Harald Fairhair, tried centralizing Norway, but he taxed farmers aggressively. So in order to grow crops elsewhere, they moved to Iceland. And Icelandic historians usually consider Iceland to be fully settled by 930, because also in this year, the Icelandic Commonwealth was officially formed. So there were enough people to actually develop a government system. So under the Godard system, which is basically the chieftain system, the most powerful people were these Viking chieftains, or Godi, actually, it's been a while, who are not confined really any geographical boundaries. So it wasn't feudalism. Iceland never really developed a feudal structure. But in exchange for the chieftains protecting their supporters' interests on their little plots of land that were kind of not really defined, the supporters would provide military assistance So they were. It's kind of like a bunch of Viking clans around the island. And once every year, for a period about, I think, like a week or so, all of these chieftains would gather at this place called the Althing, which is Iceland's parliament, so to speak, which actually still exists today. So Iceland has one of the oldest parliaments in the world, but it's not the oldest, I don't think. I think the Tynwald beats it by about like 10 or 30 years. So the Althing, this was the site of the old Althing, and these buildings probably wouldn't have been there at the time. That was just done by Iceland's like National Park Service. The old Althing corresponded to this area of Iceland called Thingvellir, hence Thingvellir National Park, which is one of the most famous parks in Iceland, I gotta say. So these Althing meetings are conducted here 2 weeks in June. Okay, they were conducted for 2 weeks in June. The Althing consisted of 39 chieftains and their advisors, and how it worked was they appointed a law speaker, or logsog amadur, who clarified logs at this special rock called Logberg, or Law Rock. I couldn't find a picture of that. Because of, nobility, and because they're just the descendants of Ingolfur Nansen, the descendants of that guy had the honor of basically sanctifying the meeting. And so I wouldn't really know how to make an analogy of this. It's not really like Congress. So when these people came over to Iceland, they were worshipping Norse mythology that the Marvel Universe has kind of milked dry. Like Odin, Thor, etc. So Iceland formally adopted Christianity in the year 1000, which is a pretty neat year. So King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway realized that he wanted to broaden Christianity by sending all these missionaries to Iceland, who were partially successful. They kind of converted only a few people, but it wasn't like a majority of the population. So by the time of Harald Hardrada, which is, I'm not talking about like 1066, Icelandic Christians asked Norway to kind of step up their game, because they were the minority still. So war between the pagans and the Christians seemed inevitable. So at the next Althing, the law speaker, Thorgeir Thorkelson, basically spent a day and night thinking about it under a tent. And then he finally decided that Iceland was to become Christian, but all religions would be tolerated, which is a pretty neat compromise, and it goes down as like a bit of a legend in Icelandic history. But Thorgeir, interestingly, was himself a pagan, so he took all of his idols of like Odin and Thor and then threw it down this large waterfall called Godafoss, which is like the largest waterfall in Iceland, and it's like, it's pretty cool. It's like larger than Niagara Falls even. I can like show you a picture later. Let's see. So during the 9th and 11th centuries, all of these Icelanders started to write down their culture and history down in what's called the Age of Sagas. And this is where all the Icelandic literature is based off of. So these are like prose stories, which often captured historical events, but kind of like the Greek epic, they kind of added a bit of like drama and stuff. So they kind of overemphasized like the nature sometimes of their situations. So what's interesting is that Iceland produced a high amount of literature for such a small population. That's one of the main puzzles of Icelandic history. Why did all these people suddenly start writing down their history? No one really exactly knows, although there's some theories. So the most famous, arguably, is Ari Thorgilsson, or Ari the Wise. He wrote down the Islendingabok, which basically details the history of Iceland from about like 930 up to his time, which is like the 1100s. Okay, and then he may have written this other book called the Landnámabók, which basically details the settlement of Iceland, and that's how we know about Ingolfur Nansen and I'm blanking on that Swedish guy who like circumnavigated Iceland. And interestingly enough, J.R.R. Tolkien had like this Icelandic nanny, so he got introduced to Icelandic sagas at a young age, and he actually used them to write his Middle-earth saga. So everything about like Sauron and Smaug and hobbits, all were practically plagiarized from these texts. Like the Ring, the idea of the Ring, if you like Lord of the Rings, has kind of been like repeated over and over in literature, and no one really realizes it. So in the Age of the Sturlungs is really Iceland's only warlike period. This is its conversion, or this is when its transformation from Commonwealth to a vassal of Norway. So it began in 1220 when this guy named Snorri Sturluson, Sturluson, chieftain of the Sturlung clan, became a vassal to this Hakon IV of Norway. But Hakon IV was really ambitious, and he wanted to bring Iceland under Norwegian rule. And the Sturlungs basically declared war on all clans that were resistant, and though Snorri was killed in the process, and I think some of his sons carried out the fight. So after 22 to 44 years, Iceland basically just gave up and signed the Gamli Satmali, or Old Covenant, with Norway, saying that Iceland would be ruled under the Norwegian crown. And the one theory that the Icelanders did this was because Norway is a lot more stronger economically, militarily, and politically than Iceland, and Norway was their largest trading partner. So if they kept fighting, Norway could possibly embargo them, and that would mean terrible economic repercussions for Iceland. So they basically just gave up their commonwealth and then became this client of Norway. So we enter the medieval era. Iceland, as part of Norway, remember, would eventually join with Denmark, Sweden, and all their territories to become the Kalmar Union in 1397, which was this economic community. So I think in the Middle Ages up until about the 1700s, anything that happens in Europe happens about 100 years later in Iceland. So the Black Death was hitting mainland Europe in the 1340s. It took until about the early 1400s to actually, for the trading ships to get the Black Death to Iceland. And that happened in 2 waves, and probably in both waves, half of Iceland died since there's a lack of immunity. By the 1500s, the Kalmar Union had turned Lutheran because of all the Reformation that was happening, and at the moment it became Lutheran, Iceland was mainly Catholic, and the Kalmar Union became really aggressive and tried to enforce this Lutheranism on Iceland. And there was this bishop that fiercely resisted named Jan Arason, who is the last Catholic bishop of Iceland. And basically, I forgot if it was the Norwegians or the Danes or the own Icelanders that basically made an example of him by chopping off his head in 1550. After that, everyone was like, nope, I don't want my head. I guess I'll become Lutheran then. And Iceland is still Lutheran today. If you guys have visited Iceland, there's a church called Hallgrímskirkja, which is this massive church built off of this volcanic stones that's officially Lutheran. After Sweden secedes from the Kalmar Union in 1523, Denmark and Norway are left to just fend for themselves. So they become this basically one country, although Denmark is the dominant power at this point. So the Danish rule, the region really didn't do anything at this point, and the Danish rule was known for being very oppressive and basically neglected Iceland's interests. The first thing they did was they enforced a monopoly over Iceland's merchants, so Iceland could basically only trade with Denmark. They did nothing to aid against the Turkish abductions, which basically these Muslim pirates sailed up and captured about 400 Icelanders and then sold them into slavery in North Africa. And I'm reading this, I'm actually really surprised that things in North Africa can go that north, and they knew about Iceland. And probably the hardest part for Iceland ever in history was the eruption of this volcano called Laki. This is what it looks like today. And it was the largest eruption in modern history. It severely affected the global climate, causing even crop shortages all the way in the continental US. Or what would that be today? And then the idea of the gases spreading to all the way around the world was called the mist hardships. And finally, the Danes abolished the Althing, which was really precious to Iceland, since it was a sense of Icelandic culture and pride. To cap it all off, the Danish fleet in the ensuing Napoleonic Wars was wiped out by Britain at the Battle of Copenhagen. And I think there's a verb that's informal called to get Copenhagen means to get beat very badly. So the Danes really got Copenhagen, and basically that means no military or navy to actually protect Iceland. Not that they were doing that anyway. So obviously this is gonna have some big effects on the population of Iceland itself. So this, you could say, it sparked the independence movement. So I guess inspired by the revolutions of 1848 and all this growing liberal philosophy in Europe, a bunch of Icelanders saw the potential of them declaring independence of Denmark, even though this wouldn't be achieved for like another century. It's interesting that Icelandic independence was realized or conceived at such an early age. But the only people to initially think about this were these Danish educated Icelanders. So in order to receive a good quality education in the Danish Empire, even if you were in Iceland, you had to go to the most prestigious university of the entire empire, which was the University of Copenhagen. So you had to get you had to fund a trip. So initially it was only like these wealthy Icelanders that became educated. So several Icelanders spread their independence views through newspapers, and in particular Jonas Hallgrímsson, who is particularly famous for founding this newspaper. I think it's called Fjolnir, which basically promoted these liberal ideals inside the college of the University of Copenhagen. And I think this guy is also credited with introducing like a bunch of new words to Icelandic language. Like Iceland didn't really have any words for like planet or I don't know, photosynthesis, for all these scientific words, and so I basically added them. Let's see, there's Conrad Gislason, Björn Jolfur Peterson, and this guy, Thomas Simonsen. So yeah, Jonas Hallgrímsson is like the only one that actually matters to me. And then probably the father of Icelandic independence, this guy, Jan Sigurdsson, was probably the most influential. He was an ambassador to the Danish king for some time. He convinced the Danish king to reopen the Althing, and he did. And basically this guy chaired it, and then he steps out and starts talking about independence, and then the Danes respond by re-shutting down the Althing again, and it was like so much about that. Although, what's interesting is that Icelanders really didn't react at all, probably due to their long distance from Denmark, which Denmark really didn't effectively govern them. So in a sense, they were already practically independent. In 1874, which is, if you're keeping track, that's 1,000 years after the initial settlement, Denmark finally granted Iceland home rule because good old days, and it's very historical. So they appoint a minister named Hannes Hafstein to become the first minister to the Danish cabinet, which shows increasing Icelandic political activity in the empire. And then the Act of Union, signed in 1918, it granted Iceland full autonomy.
Someone want to close that door, please?
Iceland joined with Denmark in like a personal union, so Iceland was kind of free to govern itself, but still operating under the Danish crown. This is after World War I. So finally, Icelanders gained control of the courts in 1920, so now they were able to govern themselves using all three branches of government. And then World War II was probably the moment where Iceland became very modern, because up to this point, they were like a poorly agricultural farming community with not really significant technological advances. But World War II changed all that. So Iceland's official stance was neutral during World War II, although I think the Germans invaded Norway, and they did actually have plans to invade Iceland. So then Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, reacted by, holy crap, we gotta go fortify Iceland before the Germans take it. And so the United Kingdom invaded Iceland, or at least that's what it says in the sources. Although, since the Icelanders really didn't put up much of a fight, I wouldn't really see it as an invasion, more like an occupation. But the Icelanders, I think before they invaded, they stated that they would be able to lend arms and help the Allies in World War II. So they were on their side all along. So in 1941, the U.S. finally got into the war, and then Iceland was transferred to them, who established an air base at Keflavik, which is this city very close to Reykjavik, and I think now that's an international airport. That's how you get into Iceland. You fly to Keflavik. So under insistence in the UK and the US, Iceland finally took the last big step and declared full independence on June 17th, 1944. And they had a staggering vote for an independence movement, or for independence, 97%, and then a 95% vote for a national constitution. And then this guy named Sven Bjornsson, who was formerly a minister to Denmark, became the first president of Iceland. So following independence, Iceland basically was split into main three political parties. There was a Socialist Party, there was the Icelandic National Party, which I think was kind of like the middle, and then the Progressive Party, which was a bit more conservative, I think. So on March 30th, 1949, Iceland became the smallest country to become a member of NATO, even though there were riots. There were like several black and white photos of this. This is like right in front of the Althing. The Reykjavik had to call out the police, but no one died, and I don't think there were not too many arrests, I don't think. So the first thing that Iceland did after World War II was industrialize the fishing industry, using money from the Marshall Plan, even though I really don't think they needed it because they weren't really war-torn. But I think Iceland benefited the most from the Marshall Plan because it was the most money per capita since it had such a small population. And this was the fuel for economic growth. And then over time, Iceland got a bit too ambitious with its fishing rights, so it kept expanding until it went to the UK's fishing waters. And then they actually had a brief dispute in the 70s called the Cod War. And here you actually see, I don't think you can see it, there's a United Kingdom ship right here attacking an Iceland ship. And there were only like tens of people who died, and it actually ended a draw. So those of you talking about Icelandic neutrality, they fought in a war. A legit war. And then, so during the Cold War, obviously, Iceland was on the side of the U.S. And at the conclusion of the Cold War, Iceland hosted a summit at this house called the Hofty House, which is somewhere in Reykjavik. I don't exactly know like where. In 1986, between Reagan and Gorbachev, and I don't think I know like anything about that further. Okay, so. In the modern times, I guess we're getting into modern history now. So in the 1990s, Iceland became more European, I guess, by joining the European Union and then the EEA. Iceland's economic growth finally ran out in 2008, and the world had a recession. Iceland was hit hard because its three privately owned banks, or its national three privately owned banks, all defaulted. And actually, this marks the largest economic crisis experienced by any country relative to its size, so you have to factor in Iceland's small size. So in an effort to stabilize the situation, the Icelandic government stated that all domestic deposits to Iceland banks would be guaranteed because in a recession or a depression, the primary thing is to get the banks flowing again. So they had to give people confidence by doing that. They imposed strict capital controls to make sure the kroner, which was the currency of Iceland, didn't go wild. And they secured a $5 billion debt package from the IMF. It was, I think, the main relief efforts were led by, I forgot her name, Johanna something. She's actually the first openly gay head of state, so, and she was female, so it's like liberal pride. And about 5,000 people emigrated from Iceland, which marked the largest emigration since 1887. Why 1887? Just cuz.
Wasn't that around the time of the potato famine as well for Ireland?
Yeah, or I think it was a bit earlier. I never really learned why, because I think Iceland doesn't really grow potatoes or anything. The 2008 deception thing would surface again in the Panama Papers scandal. The culprit was the Prime Minister Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson. He was elected shortly after the recession, after that Johanna, gay head of state person, which I can't remember her last name. But prior to the election, Gunnlaugsson owned 50% interest on this bank called Wintris, a company that owed bonds of one of the bankrupt Icelandic banks, which at this point, that bank would be circulating again. In 2010, shortly after he was elected, he secretly sold his half to his wife, who owns the other half. So now his family is now in direct control of Wintris and that bank, which I don't know. So the Panama Papers were leaked in 2016, I think. Yeah, it's actually pretty recent. So it was revealed that he was actually using his government money to finance Wintris. So if he's financing Wintris, he'd actually be financing the shareholders of Wintris, which would be his wife and kind of indirectly himself. So using government money to basically pay for yourself wouldn't be a really good thing it wouldn't be a really good use for citizens' taxes. So obviously these Icelandic citizens are pissed at him. So it triggered an anti-government protest in front of the Althing on April 4th, 2016. And to get a scale for how big this was, that was it. Like, I was sitting like right there, and it was like, when I was in Iceland, I was like right here or something, and this was all empty. So like, this was like a 5-day protest, and like an eighth of the population of the country showed up, so it's like really huge. And they got like really aggressive. It was like crazy. So they started like invoking all these ancient rituals by putting like sheep's heads on a spike, which hadn't really been seen by like, and since like Viking times, which meant kind of like, and finally I think Gunnlaugsson resigned under pressure, and there was a new guy elected, and then things got rolling again. But like, another important thing in modern Icelandic history is soccer. So I don't know what the official tournament is, but in the Eurozone, Iceland qualified for the first time in 2016. And it was a really big thing for them. And actually, when I was there, I talked to several people in Iceland, and they're like, oh yeah, I know that guy. He went to my high school. Everyone knows each other. So yeah, they like beat England, and that was really like good for them. This was their picture right after that. And I think I was back in the United States when they lost to France, but still, that was pretty good. Like, I think they qualified for the first time for FIFA, so that was amazing. And yeah, it's really great how Iceland takes a lot of pride in their country, more so than, say, the United States. So yeah, that's what Iceland's all about, survival and national pride. That's it.
Any questions? Any questions? Anyone? Questions?
Also,
Anyone?
not from Iceland, that means go Iceland.
Yay. Any questions? No questions? None? No questions? No questions.
I've heard that a big issue that they're having right now is with the deforestation of Iceland.